Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Holy Toledo Sports Edition. I'm Brad Rieger, and today we get to connect with Dan Saevig. And Dan Saevig is our resident hockey historian here in Toledo, and he's also the chairperson of the Toledo Hockey Hall of Fame. So we're going to talk all things Toledo hockey with Dan. Dan Saevig, it is great to be here with you, and thanks for spending some time with us so we can delve into the rich history of Toledo hockey and specifically the Hall of Fame. But just thanks for being here, Dan.
It's great to be with you, Brad. Been a friend for many, many years, and when you talk about the rich history of hockey in Toledo, it really is a rich history. 70 years now of pro hockey in this town, and just to see the ups and the downs and how it's just taken off since the Walleye operation has been involved, it's just wonderful to see.
Yeah. Before we get to the Hall of Fame stuff, let's touch base on you and hockey. When did hockey grab you? Or how old were you?
When I was a child. And what's interesting about it is back then, they would do anything they could to get people to come to games. Hockey's not always been successful like it has been since the Walleye came in 2009. It was a situation where they gave away free kids tickets in the elementary school system in Oregon. And I got a free ticket, but you had to have an adult with you. So my grandmother actually went with me. We rode the old community traction bus from her home in North Toledo. We went to the game that night, and
At the sports arena.
Yeah, the old
Right.
sports arena over at 1 Main Street, and it was just it was a wonderful time. And I think as a child, you're drawn to the colors, the sounds, and everything else. And there were so many neat things. There wasn't a huge crowd there, 2,800 probably, but I think just the speed of the game and the excitement and the energy was something that drew me in at a young age. And as I got older, we had a neighbor who actually took tickets at the sports arena, and he would drive me down there. And I think the biggest thing was probably back in 1974. My mom passed away from leukemia. And I was in 8th grade at the time, and I had been going to the Blades games and the Hornets games, but that was when the Gold Diggers came in, the Miracle on Main Street, and I think the community just responded to it. I know certainly during my time at Facet, middle school, that all the boys at that time were just really, really into hockey. And it was nice to see because, I really had always enjoyed it. So I think that was really an elevating thing. And one of the things that my dad did was that he got season tickets in year 2, and we had them throughout my time in high school before I went to college. And my sister and I and my dad, and it was a family event. It was an opportunity for us to do things together as a family. And so it really meant a lot. And when I eventually got into television, I think that really kind of took it to another level.
Sure did.
And then I ended up doing broadcasting for radio and television in the International Hockey League for Salt Lake City and San Diego, and doing their games. And it just became more and more. And all of a sudden, the Blade, when the Storm came in 1991, hockey immediately became hot again, and they needed somebody that had a hockey background and a media background, and they approached me about writing for them, and I did that part-time for 15 years or so. And it's just it's like being married. I kept I moved up in the world, right. And I just got lucky, and that's really what it came down to.
Who were your heroes as a kid? Who'd you cheer for?
Either and it's interesting.
The Gold Diggers or the Red Wings, or
I didn't. I went to Red Wings games and enjoyed. Gordie Howe was obviously somebody who I really respected, and the nice thing about that is that I ended up emceeing banquets that Gordie and his wife Colleen were involved in, and so I got to know them well. And I'm an avid game-worn minor league hockey jersey collector, and Gordie went through all my sweaters and was lighting up when he said, "Oh, I played against this team, and I remember this team," and everything else.
Are you had Gordie Howe at your house?
Well, he was not at my house, no, but it was at another location,
Okay.
and I had a display, and he came over and started going through all this stuff, and just
Right.
Really, it was just neat to see. But it's fun. And I think that just kind of drew me into it. And then, when I got into television, that was probably the big thing. I started out at Channel 24 and then went to Channel 13 before I went back to get my MBA. And I I really kind of grew up with a lot of those players during those back-to-back championship teams in '82 and '83, and your then soon-to-be
dating, yes.
wife was an usher down
Laura,
at the sports
yes.
arena, and I would see Laura down there all the time, and it was neat, and I think it was sort of a coming-of-age type thing. I was working in TV. As a 20-year-old, actually as an 18-year-old, I started. And once I got into it, I got to know the people and the personalities. And one thing that you learn over time, especially when you cover all sports, hockey players are the absolute best to work with. They're the neatest people. They're just down to earth. And I think that's maybe part of the game itself, in that people really, it's a team first game, and they want to do, they're not putting on airs or anything like that. And what you see on the ice is what you see off the ice as well. And so really developed relationships. And quite frankly, a lot of those people, here we are 40, 50 years later, and I'm texting them or talking with them. And it's just neat to see, that hockey bond has been there. So that's a roundabout way to answer how I got involved into it. And my grandmother, she lived to be 101 and a half, and she said to me, my only regret in life was taking you to hockey games because you're hockey crazy. And there's probably some truth to that, but I can think of a lot worse things to be crazy
For
about.
sure. So the sports arena had a lot of character. One of the things I remember was the small press box that was almost hanging over the ice. And you spent some time up there.
And here's the thing: the sports arena was built by Tim Gladio and a small group of people who originally had built the Burdett Avenue Ice Arena, and this was before World War II, and then it was used during the war for independent hockey. But he decided that this town needed a major league sports facility, and he built the sports arena very quickly. In less than a year, it went from ground to opening the doors. And it was just packed from the very beginning. They sold out every game that first season. Of course, went on to win the IHL Turner Cup, and then they went on to win the U.S. Open, the Senior Open Championship during that 47-48 season. But they made that building. That building was constructed from World War II surplus materials. And so when you saw the seats, and when you saw the old gray, that was battleship gray paint with the seats that they had in the sports arena, that was just war surplus paint. The press box that you referred to was nothing more than an 18-wheel rig that they bolted to the roof of the sports arena. It was also the best place to call a game. I've done radio and television broadcasts literally probably in 70 different buildings from the West Coast to the East Coast, and it was the absolute best place to call a game.
Why was that?
Because you were right on top of the action. You could hear everything that happened on the ice. You were literally looking down, and I think that's what really made it special. 60 years that building was here, and it's created so many memories for so many people in this community. By the time it got near the end, it needed a change, and thank goodness that the Huntington Center, was envisioned and then built. And but the sports arena, that was a great place to watch a game. But it was a different time, and I think one of the things that people, sometimes people overlook is that hockey hasn't always been successful in this community. It's been successful since the Walleye came to town and the Mud Hens operation took it over. But if you look back from 1947 until the last year of 2007, you can count on less than two hands the number of teams that were actually profitable. And I can't tell you how many times I would hear stories from players that they'd get off the ice, their paychecks would be waiting there, and it'd be an immediate dash to run to the bank to make sure that their paychecks wouldn't bounce. And and I think that's one of the neat things is that this organization has done a wonderful job of selling family entertainment. And that is one of the things that, at the sports arena, it was hard to do because it had a reputation to a degree of, being a smoky type facility that that people were throwing chairs on the ice, and
Players climbing over
over the glass, going after the fans, and stick swinging, but hockey was different back then, and it, like everything else in life, it evolves and it changes, but it was a great place to watch a game. It was not necessarily the type of place I would take my family to watch a game, but it was a great place to watch a game, and if you loved the game like I did, it was perfect. And plus, it had that small ice surface, so you saw a lot of physical contact. And during times when there was really an emphasis on intimidation in hockey, that much of that has gone out. I mean, teams that play a heavy game, especially during the playoffs, but you don't have that, the stage fights, and you don't have the guys going after people and things like that. The game has changed. But at that point in time, it was a wonderful time. It was a wonderful time to grow up. It was a wonderful time for me to spend time in the media, and then of course, working both on the electronic side and on the print side. But yeah, there's so many things. And when they built that sports arena, the very first Mercury's team, actually, they were in a rush to get it done before opening day. And so the Mercury's players were enlisted to take little ball-peen hammers, and they actually hammered in the numbers on each of the seats at the sports arena. And little
All
things,
hands on
little
deck.
little things like that just add to the the lore of the sports arena and the interesting times that were had there over the years.
Dan, the fan base for the Walleye is phenomenal, right? A rabid, enthusiastic fan base. But that's actually been like this here in Toledo for decades, as far as the enthusiasm.
Yeah, the diehard fans have always been there.
Right.
But one of the things that I learned very early on is that diehard fans are not necessarily going to keep a team in business. And you might have 12 to 1,500, and the Storm had that, and the Gold Diggers had that at a variety of times where that number was increased. But for the most part, it's not enough to make it. This is a business, and you have to be profitable, and you have to put an entertaining product on the ice. And one of the things that I have found more than anything else, and in doing these reunions where we bring back players, and all these other people, and you hear about the production, the experience. And this is a little bit of a long story, but this is a great story because it really exemplifies how people from outside the community view the presentation of that the Walleye put on of this organization. And we had our last Hall of Fame ceremony here, and Gordie Cowan went into the Hall of Fame, and he was about to celebrate his 93rd birthday. And I had worked with his daughter, Leslie, for about 6 months before we did the reveal video to tell him, hey, you're going into the Hall of Fame. We did it under the guise of there's an IHL historian that wanted to interview him. And so that's when we sprung it on him and told him the truth. But I had worked with Leslie about 6 months prior, getting everything set up. And so when you sit there and you talk to somebody and you hear all these things, and we sent the reveal video to her the day it was released, and she called me that night from Calgary, and she said, that was really well produced. And I told her, I said, well, thank you. I said, the Walleye organization really takes a lot of pride in doing a great production, and they really, really do. And they come into town the very first night. They're signing autographs from the time they walked off the ice before the game started until the last 4 minutes of the game. I finally Gordie really wants to watch some hockey. And Gordie sits down with his one daughter, and I'm standing up there on the top with Leslie, and she turns to me and she said, I'm amazed at the production that's involved with this, and the energy and the music and the lights and the sound and how the fans react to it. And I told her, I said, well, thank you. I said, I talked to a lot of NHL and American League people, and they say this organization is run as well as any of those teams at those levels. And, that was nice. So Saturday morning, they all come down to see my basement. My basement's kind of a Toledo hockey museum, if you will. And after we get done, I said, let's go to Paco's. Gord, do you remember Tony Paco's? And he said, oh, sure, I remember Paco's. And so we go over to Paco's and everything. And the waitress passes out the menus. And, Leslie and everybody else opens up their trifold thing, and the first thing that Leslie notices is that, oh, Burt Reynolds signed the first hot dog bun here. And I explained to her, yeah, this is how many people have done it and everything else, and Burt was the first. And then she said, oh, I've worked with Burt Reynolds. And I said, oh, that's interesting. So we order our food. And I said, listen, I know a lot about Gord. You know a little bit about my family and I, but I really don't know anything about you three. So I turned to the one daughter, Randy. I said, Randy, what do you do? And she said, well, I work for Wyndham Hotels in Canada. I decide where they're going to place their hotels and negotiate the purchase of the land and everything else. I said, that's a big job. That's really cool. So I turned to Leslie. I said, Leslie, you made the comment that you work with Burt Reynolds. I said, what do you do? And she said, well, I'm in the entertainment business. And I said, oh, what do you do? And she said, well, I started out in the music business, and she started naming awesome jazz groups, and I'd heard of them all, but my wife's a jazz aficionado. I'm not necessarily so much. And then I said, well, what do you do now? And she said, well, I'm in the film and the television industry. And I said, oh, that makes sense and everything. And I turned to her daughter, Johanna, and I said, Johanna, what about yourself? And she said, well, I'm also in the film and business and everything. And so I turned to Leslie and I said, well, you must be in the Internet Movie Database, where if you go look up all the movies and you can look up everything anybody's ever worked on. She said, yeah, I'm in there. So we were sitting there and the food came and Gordy was munching on a hot dog. And I said, Gord, you got a daughter and a granddaughter that's in the movie business. How come you've never been in a film? And he looks up from his hot dog and says, because they've never asked. Anyhow, so I said, Leslie, what are some of the projects you've been involved with? And she starts naming off all these things. And I'd heard of every single one of them, but I'll be honest with you, Brad, I hadn't seen one of them. So we get done. They go to the restroom to clean up. I'm going to take them over to show them where the sports arena used to be. And I go out in the car to warm up the car. And first thing I do is go to the Internet Movie Database. And I said, I got to look up this lady. So the first thing that comes up on the screen is nominated for 2 Primetime Emmy Awards, winner of 1 award. And they come around the corner about a minute later, and I said, Leslie, are you kidding me? I've been talking to you for 6-8 months now. And I said, I have to go onto the internet to find out, you're so accomplished. Right. And she just shrugged and she said, yeah, maybe. Well, it turns out she was the executive producer of Fargo. Mm-hmm. She was the executive producer of Fraggle Rock. She's the head of Film Alberta, and which is one of the top movie filming places anywhere. And everything that she said about production and the entertainment value all of a sudden came hitting me like a brick. Yeah. Because
that's why she was tuned into it.
And she's a professional. She understood this, and she recognized it right away from the beginning that this organization really knows what it's doing. And this is a lady who was actually born in Toledo, Brad. And this is what's interesting is that, and this is one of the many things I love about hockey is that these are the kind of stories that are generated because of the sport and the memories that are created because of it. And, they left here, and the last day they were here, she reached into her bag and she handed me a toque, as they call them, a toque in Canada. And I looked at it, and it was a Fargo toque, and so that it had somebody with a gun. Billy Bob Thornton, I think, was one of the stars of it. I still, unfortunately, have not seen one of them. But, and I just laughed, and I said, Leslie, I'm probably the first person in North America that's got a piece of merchandise from a franchise that I've never even seen yet, and she laughed. But, these are the kind of things that happen in doing these types of things, and just makes it even more enjoyable and even more special. But what it comes down to, and it's what I hear all the time, is that, and I've heard this from players, I talk to a lot of people in the National Hockey League, I talk to a lot of people in the American League, they rave about this organization. I mean, they talk about how well they do everything on the ice and off the ice. And I think that's just a really strong testament to the leadership here and what they're doing to make things special for for the fans here in this town. And, this is the model franchise in the ECHL. But if you talk to people in the American Hockey League, this is run just as well as any team in the American Hockey League, which is one level up. And it's run just as well as some of the NHL teams. I had a guy named Dave Gans who was here, and he's come back for some of the Hall of Fame ceremonies. And his best buddy is Dave Andrechuk, who's in the Hockey Hall of Fame in Toronto. And they were in each other's weddings. And when Dave went into the Hall of Fame in Toronto, he invited Dave Gans to come with and see it. And then when the Tampa Bay Lightning did something for Dave Andrechuk down in Tampa, he asked him to come down. So he went down as well. And he told me, he said, Toledo did a better job than Tampa Bay did in recognizing their people. And to me, that really says all you need to know about, how I think as fans we can appreciate and how important it is for an organization to be well run. And this organization is really, really, really well run. They know what they're doing. And that's the other neat thing about that, Brad, is it's going to guarantee the stability for the sport for many years to come in this community. And it's part of our blood. It really is.
And Dan, the Toledo Hockey Hall of Fame, you're the chairman of the selection committee, correct? You're the chairman of the selection committee.
Yeah, and I'm just one of basically 9 votes. Okay.
What do you look at criteria-wise?
Well, and it's interesting, and I hear this from fans all the time. Why isn't so and so in the Hall of Fame yet? Why isn't so and so on the ballot yet? I hear that from players, former players as well. And, it's really, really interesting. And we've got 8 people on the committee, and then you have a fan vote. And the fan vote is very important. We always start out with that, and the organization will solicit the fans. We'll have 25 names for them to choose from. You list your top 5, and then what we do is we get that information, and then we actually, when we do have our meeting, and the committee is a very well-rounded committee. We've got, people like Jim McCabe, who's in the Hall of Fame, Nick Vitucci, who is in the Hall of Fame, and a player and a coach, and Derek Booth, who played here, for the Toledo Storm. You got John Guger from the Toledo Blade, Mark Monroe, who worked for the Toledo Blade, Jim Tishy, and, people that have been around the sport for a long, long time. And so basically what we do is that, we'll go around the room and we'll say, okay, give us your top 5. And then we will put it on the whiteboard, and we will just go around, okay, who's your top 5, who's your top 5, who's your top 5, etc. And then when it's done, we will add up the votes. I always go last because I don't want to steer anybody in any particular direction. Right. And there's a couple things that I'm really proud of. Number one, Jim McCabe says that he is most proud of the fact that we have gotten the right people in at the right time in the right order. And these people have been here since the very beginning for the most part on this committee. The other thing is
2016 was the first induction?
2016, yeah, that sounds about right off the top of my head. We had 5 the very first year.
Okay. No, you've had 7 inductions.
We've had 7 induction ceremonies. Yeah. Correct. And we did have 7 one year because of COVID, and we had to combine some things. But it's very hard when you think about all the thousands of players who have played here over the years, and you realize that just to be even on the ballot is pretty an amazing thing. But what's also interesting, the second part of that is that the fan vote, and what's interesting is the fans are very knowledgeable in this community, and invariably in every class of 5, 3 or 4 of those top 5 fan votes will correspond with the people who are actually inducted. So the people are very knowledgeable. It's a little bit harder, I think, for fans to relate perhaps to players from the Mercuries and the Blades and the Hornets and even some of the Gold Digger players, because things have changed and evolved and everything else over time. But for the most part, this community does just an absolutely great job of doing it. And so that's how we go through the process, and to make sure I don't steer anybody in any particular way or direction. I wait till the very end. I do mine last. And you know, we'll sit there and we may have some discussions following, depending on how the votes come out. The last couple of years, the top five has been very clear cut. There's been other times when we've had like the fourth or fifth place person. There's been ties, and so we'll have subsequent discussion. And the other thing that we do, Brad, is that, you know, once the five are selected, the committee comes up with 5 new names to replace those on the ballot, and sometimes that's even more difficult. And you know, fans come up and say, well, what's the criteria? So we look at a variety of things. We look at, you know, their tenure, how many years did they play in Toledo? We looked at championships. We looked at individual awards, and we look at statistics. We also asked that difficult question, which is hard sometimes to answer, but that's why we have former players, is what was that person like in the locker room?
Wow.
Were they a good teammate? Were they a leader? You know, you talk about a guy like Paul Tantardini, and Jim McCabe will tell you that Paul Tantardini was the best teammate he ever played with in all of his years of pro hockey. Because Tanner would go and protect people, he would go after people, he would do what was best. He was great with the players on the ice, he was great with the players off the ice. And so that's another variable that comes into play, and that's why it's so important to have the caliber of people on the committee that we do, because they really do know the sport, they know the history of it, they also know the people, and you know, that's what's really, really neat.
And Dan, for the induction class, it's more like an induction weekend, right?
Oh, it really is. And so what we try to do is, these are usually every other year, but not necessarily. A lot depends on, like, if there's a really big thing coming up, like we had when we had the All-Star game here at the Huntington Center, and then we had that big event at the Glass City Center, and you know, when we've had outdoor games and things like that, you know, we try to have some dovetailing, and the reason is quite simple, because invariably we have alumni events tied to it, so it makes sense for former players to see their former teammates being inducted into the Hall of Fame, because a lot of them are coming back to play in an alumni game or just to be there for some of the activities. And so, you know, we try to tie it in with something major. We work with the organization, and you know, we've had a couple times where we've skipped 2 years to fit something, the major that was coming up. But that's just, you know, the Hall of Fame is just a part of it. You know, we're doing these reunions, which have been an absolute blast for the fans, for the alumni. People are coming back. Like this past year, we had the 50th anniversary of the 74-75 Miracle on Main Street team. And to see the fans literally lined up, snaking through the entire concourse, basically, of the Huntington Center, to get autographs of their heroes when they were kids, is just an amazing thing. And as much as the fans love it, the players love it too. And I got to tell you a funny story. Brian Smolinski, who is probably the most accomplished NHLer to come out of the Toledo area. He's played 1,000 games in the NHL, played in NHL All-Star games, played in, you know, World Cups and that type of things for Team USA out of Genoa. Grew up watching the 74-75 Gold Diggers. And last year when they were signing autographs, you know, the concourse is packed, and I see in a distance, I said, that looks like Brian Smolinski. So I yelled, "Smoke!" And he looked up and came running over. I said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "Man, these were my idols when I was a kid. Here's a guy who played in the NHL for, you know, multiple years, who now works for the National Hockey League, and he came down from Detroit because he wanted to take one more peek at his idols."
Right.
And that's the kind of stuff that just sends shivers up your spine when you hear these stories, and that's what makes this, you know, this so special. It's special for the fans, it's special for the players, and you know, I think you look at how the people respond to whether it's been the 40th anniversary of the Gold Diggers or the 30th anniversary of the back-to-back Riley Cup champions Durham teams, or this year's 70th anniversary celebration of anybody, including legacies whose parents and grandparents played here that we introduced on the ice. That's what really makes it special. Right. And to hear the stories from them and from the fans, it means a lot to people. It really, really does.
Dan, let me tap into your rich reservoir of knowledge here with some deep cut questions. What is a anecdote or a fact or a tidbit that every hockey fan here in Toledo should know, but we don't know?
Well, a lot of it is tied. Well, for example, the sports arena, the stories that we shared about the fact that the sports arena was built with World War II surplus products. I think a lot of the things that that people just always assume because Toledo, and a lot of people don't realize this, and we've talked about this during the pregame ceremonies, is that Toledo has won more professional minor hockey championships than any city in North America, save one exception, and that's Hershey, Pennsylvania. Toledo's won 11 playoff championships. Hershey has won 13. But that to me is a huge factor. But the irony of it all is that of those 11 teams that won championships here, probably only 4 of them were profitable. And, because it didn't necessarily back in the day always translate success on the ice to folks in the stands actually enjoying the games. So I think that's a little tidbit that I think is something that for this city to be very proud of, and I can't wait for that time to come when the Walleye add to that total and make it 12. And it will happen. It will definitely happen. And I can only imagine how, because hockey has become so ingrained in this community now, I can only imagine. I can remember the ticker tape parade in '75 when they went through downtown, and the ticker tape was flying everywhere, and then the '82 and '83 ones with the Jeeps that they used to take them down, through downtown. Can only imagine what the celebration will be like, should the Walleye win, because I think it will be on, 3 or 4 times the scale, both in the actual parade itself and then actually in the turnout as well. Because hockey is really, for a while with the Gold Diggers and some of the times of the Storm, the sports arena became a place to see and be seen. And that lasted for a while, but then it would fade off. Look at the Walleye attendance. It shows no signs of abating, and it just continues to grow and grow and grow. But they work at it. I mean, they work at, between the groups and the tickets and the outreach and everything else in the community that they do, they work to get those people here. I think the other thing that strikes me is that you hear from other people from out of town who come in and they experience it for the very first time, and they're overwhelmed. And it's whether it's the on ice product, the off ice product, or a combination thereof, it just really makes it special. Now, are there other stories that I can share with you? A bunch of them. Sure. Are they stories that probably shouldn't be shared publicly on a podcast? Probably. But some funny stories and, things that happened, back when I was covering the team. There was, I used to do grade cards. And I would do quarterly grade cards for the Storm. And I had one particular player named Daryl Bootland that I went after really, really hard in the paper. And
he didn't appreciate your feedback?
Oh, well, not initially, but it turned out pretty well. I still talk with coaches and general managers in the AHL and the NHL. I mean, they'll ask for, or even in Europe, they'll ask for, I scouted 2 guys on Fort Wayne's team last year for a team over in Europe and gave one a yay and one a nay. But I still talk to a lot of people. People will call and just chit chat and everything, or have you seen this player? Have you seen that player? So I'd written a pretty scathing indictment of a first-year pro named Daryl Bootland, played for the Storm, and I really, I want to say I was critical not only of his play but of his focus on the unimportant things like skating down the ice and his helmet falling off and his locks flying through the air, rather than developing an edge to his game and playing like he was capable of. So I always made sure when I did those grade cards that I would write them so that they would appear in the newspaper the day of a game, because I didn't want to write something 2 weeks out before the next game and then have the players stew about it or not have the chance to say something to me. And most of them, if there was something in the paper they didn't like, they wouldn't. So I walk into the sports arena and I'm ready. I'm walking up to the press box and I see Jim Nill, who's the assistant general manager of the Detroit Red Wings, standing at the top, right by the press box stairway. And I said, I know what he's going to want to talk about. So Jim is now the general manager, by the way, of the Dallas Stars in the National Hockey League. So I get up there and he said, "Hey, Dan, how you doing?" And I said, "I'm doing well, Jim. How about yourself?" He said, "I'm doing fine." He said, "Hey, I saw what you wrote in the paper today about Booter." And I said, "Yeah." And all of a sudden he leaned forward and stuck out his hand and said, "Thank you very much."
You did their work for him.
And the funny thing is, the next year he was in the National Hockey League, because what he did was he could cut out what I had put in the newspaper and he taped it in his locker, and it was his motivating thing. And I remember that after the game, I got pulled in by Jeff Mitchell, who was the captain of the team that time, and he pulled me back into the changing room and said, "Hey, Dan, do you think you were fair, with Booter, with what you wrote?" And he's just being a captain. He's doing the right thing. And I said, "Well, yeah, I do." And I said, to tell me what you didn't agree with, and that type of thing. And he was being protective of his teammate and one of his teammates. But the Jim Nill story is definitely one of my favorites, because it kind of reinforced the fact that despite what some of the fans at the time that would write letters to the editor would say about the guy that was covering the hockey team, it was, it made me feel like it definitely had an inkling of what was going on with some of the players. And, but those are the kind of stories that make it interesting and make it fun. And quite frankly, what you find, Brad, is that when players retire, they don't remember necessarily most of the details of the games. Glenn Ramsey may be the exception at 91, but for the most part, most people don't remember the details of games. But what they do remember is the fun they had off the ice and their interactions with the fans. Yeah. And that's what, when you go back and all is said and done and you see that to me is what really makes it special. And then referring to the Hall of Fame, you look at a guy like Glenn Ramsey, now we do the reveal videos and we surprise them and everything else. When we first started out, the first couple of classes, we would call them. And I remember calling Glenn Ramsey to tell him that he was going to be in the inaugural class of the Toledo Hockey Hall of Fame. The phone went dead, and all of a sudden I could hear him crying. And he said to me, "I thought people had forgotten about me." And it's been the same way with many of those Hall of Famers, the guys that have gone in. It really has meant a lot to them. And he's not the only one that shed a tear on the phone. And you can see, this was their livelihood for such a long period of time. And it really meant a lot to them to be included amongst the greats in Toledo hockey history. But there's so many stories, so many, great memories and things like that it's what makes this sport so much fun.
Dan, let's finish with this one. When you're sitting in the Huntington Center watching the Walleye now play, what do you feel, just as a fan?
I think there's a variety of things. And, it's funny when you talk to players and you grew up with the game. The game has changed a lot since I started going back in the mid to late 60s. The players are so much faster. They're bigger for the most part. Their skating skills are off the charts. They think the game differently than the players did back then. You talk to a guy like Jim McCabe, and Jim McCabe will tell you, he said, "I could not play in today's game. I didn't skate well enough." And a guy like, Mark Deasley, who was, a big, strong, physical force in front of the net and in the corners at the sports arena, he couldn't play in today's game because he didn't skate well enough. And, the game has changed so much. It's totally different than it was 40, 50, 60 years ago. But what hasn't changed is the purity of the sport and the reaction of the fans. I mean, when you go to a walleye game and you see some of the same faces, it becomes another extended family. I mean, these are people, since in 15 seasons now, I've seen a lot of the same people, that have been season ticket holders since the very beginning or subsequently thereafter. And, it really is an important part of their lives. And that's what's really, really neat to see. But, when you see as many games as I have perhaps over the years, it would be easy to get jaded. But I look at every game as different, and every game is a different, it's got a different tempo to it, a different pace, and different outcomes. And that's one of the many great things about the sport is the fact that everything is different, and it's hard to get bored at a hockey game. I always tell people I would rather go to a bad hockey game than do pretty much anything else.
Right. Well, Dan, this has been fascinating and interesting, and thank you for being so generous in your time and just your recollections, and thank you for keeping the flame alive for hockey in the Toledo region. You're an incredible community guy. You're involved in a lot of community initiatives, but the reunions and the Hall of Fames and just their enthusiasm for hockey is such a great contribution to the Walleye organization and to our community.
And thank you, Brad. And it's just neat to see the appreciation from everybody involved. And it starts with the alumni, it starts with the fans, the organization. People are grateful because this organization gets it. They understand how important this legacy is, and it's a legacy now for this organization to continue to build on. And every time you walk in there and you see, we're up to 100 and some standing room only crowds and sellout crowds, and you see the reaction and everything else, that tells you how far this sport has come in the last 70 seasons of hockey being played in Toledo, and it's neat to be a small part of it.
Yeah. Thank you, Dan. Come back and see us sometime, all right?
I would love to. Thanks, Brad.
It's Dan Saevig, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, and come back again and join us. It's great.
Thank you.
It was great.
Hopefully that was